Welcome everybody to Research Alive, our 5th season and the last session of the year. It's a special honor tonight to have one of our star students who got the Research Alive Student Prize, which is generously funded by Jill de Villafranca and Dr. David Kustik. And Hannah's going to talk about cultural convergences, bringing the traditional music of New Zealand, the Māori music of New Zealand, together with the contemporary music. But I want, first, before we introduce Hannah, I wanted to say that we have another season coming up for next year. The selections haven't been made, so I can't announce who's going to be presenting next year. But again, we'll have a mixture of student presentations and faculty presentations. So without further ado, here's one of our star students, a flutist and a person who studies a great deal of music all around different kinds of flute-like instruments, Hannah Darroch.
Thank you, Stephen. I couldn't hear a word you said back there, but I'm sure it was great. And thank you in advance to the sound recording and live webcast team who are working like crazy back there. And hello to anyone who's watching online, especially my family. It's 12 p.m. on Thursday in New Zealand right now, so hi. My presentation today is based on the subject of my doctoral research. I was really interested in delving into music of my home country and really using research also as a jumping off point to create something new. I had 3 main research objectives. Firstly, I wanted to examine the context of New Zealand composition, especially during the past 30 years when there's been a revival of traditional Māori instruments that has happened. Secondly, I wanted to analyse several existing works by New Zealand composers focusing on the use of extended techniques that have made this flute sound like the traditional Māori flutes. And thirdly, I was able to commission a new work by a New Zealand composer that really looked at the convergences in sounds between all of these flutes. Today is divided into 4 very simple parts. Firstly, I'll explain a little more about what I mean by extended techniques and give you some examples of what they sound like. Secondly, I will introduce you to 2 of the Māori flutes that are the most prevalent. Thirdly, I will use some case studies of existing New Zealand compositions to explain these convergent sounds. And finally, I'll talk very briefly about some of the research creation methods used in the commissioning of the new work. So I'll start by first of all talking about this flute that I have here. A larger image on the screen for you. This was, the fingering system was patented in 1847 by German flute maker Theobald Böhm. And European flute makers for years prior had been really striving to find a flute that had standardized acoustic measurements, these connected rod mechanisms that connect to ring keys that allow one finger to actually put down multiple keys at a time, which ideally means we can play with more technical facility. And also they wanted a flute that could play very evenly from the upper extremes right down to the low. And they also wanted a flute that could play more in tune, but we could argue that. And one very important point is they wanted something that could be so standard that you could make 10 of them that would sit next to each other and play essentially very similarly. But interestingly, no sooner had they found this peak of tonal uniformity did composers and performers become really very interested in trying to push the boundaries of new sounds for this flute. A series of extended techniques were first codified in this book by Bruno Bartolozzi in 1967. And I quite like this quote to sum up the feeling of the time. He says, "The traditional system has been satisfactory as long as the musical requirements were limited to the purity and beauty of sound obtained through uniformity of timbre. But such ideals have become more and more inadequate to the needs of contemporary music. It requires a means of expression that can no longer be exclusively provided by beauty of sound or tunefulness." And I think this really sums up this thinking of, what are these new sounds that might now be possible that we have this instrument in our hands. So once he put out this book, the floodgates opened in terms of methodologies and treatises around flute-specific extended techniques. One of the very common books on this list is Robert Dick's The Other Flute, and I have no doubt there are copies in this building at the moment. He himself is a flutist. He's also a teacher and a composer. He was actually, and the story goes, he was in university, he was in a practice room one night, and his friends came and knocked on the door and said, "Hey, we're going to a Jimi Hendrix concert tonight, you should come." And he said, the classic, "I have a lesson in the morning, I have to, cram practice," as we all do. And they ended up convincing him to go, and it turned out to be the concert, the sounds that he heard, the electronic sounds, distortion, guitar, these really changed the direction of his entire career. And he really dedicated himself to finding and codifying all of these new sounds that we have. So I thought what I would do is just do a quick fire round of examples of what these sound like, especially for those that are still kind of wondering what I'm talking about. I've put them into 4 categories, the first of which are timbre techniques. So composers were interested in finding different colorings or shadings on any one particular note. So the first was they were able to really specify exactly how much air they wanted to be in the sound. So I'll play you just a regular scale. And then if I were to add sort of a 50-50 of air and sound. And often we are asked to only play with air. Timbral fingerings are another very common extended technique. I will demonstrate this not by saying very much, but by inviting you to even maybe close your eyes. I'm going to play 3 notes, all in a slightly different shade of whatever your favorite color is. And there are hundreds of these. And we can also trill between these timbral fingerings instead of doing a very standard classical trill. Timbral trills sound like this. Vowel shapes are another way of really changing the shading of a note. And I'll play one note and I'll just cycle through the vowels a, or a, e, u, something like that. And whistle tones, these are, as the name suggests, very light whistle-like sounds that are based on the harmonic series. And flutter tonguing, which also very creatively named, involves rolling the tongue and playing a note at the same time. And moving on to pitch techniques, microtones are the tiny spaces in between a regular, what we think of as a Western chromatic scale that sounds like this. And if I fill in the gaps of that scale, pitch bending really just means bending or sliding between all of those tiny increments. And vibrato, this is this could be a presentation in itself, but today I'll just demonstrate a note that has a range of different speeds and widths of vibrato. And composers really enjoy that one a lot as well. Multiple sonorities, multiphonics. This was really one of the more radical extended techniques where instead of the traditional instrument that was really known for playing a single melodic line, we could suddenly have hundreds of fingerings that allow us to play 2, 3, 4, many notes at a time. And a very basic example would be these 2 notes. And then together. And I could go all day playing those. Singing and playing, once again, as it suggests, this is when we sing a certain pitch and then play at the same time. We can either move the voice or the fingers around. And that was moving the fingers. I can also move the voice around. Also one that composers enjoy. Percussive sounds. So consonant attacks are really the classic flute example is that we usually start a note with the consonant ta. Or sometimes we use the front and the back of our tongue on a ta, ka, ta, ka, ta. And with extended techniques, basically any beginning of the note that you want can be written into a piece of music. And this is where the 21st century phenomenon of beatboxing and flute playing at the same time is where that has originated. Key clicks, as the name suggests, these are very subtle. These sorts of things that can sound very pitched. They can also be combined with percussive sounds at the same time. And lastly, tongue rams. All of these have very indicative names, I think. And this involves rolling the flute inwards that creates a kind of fun popping effect. And those sound actually 7 notes lower than the note that we play, which is cool when it's such a high instrument. Now you can imagine that all of these sounds you've just heard, when they're actually printed in music, it can look something like reading the key of a map. A lot of new symbols which are fairly standardized but do vary. And I will show you the first page of Phil Brownlee's Harakeke, and you'll see some of the sounds that you just heard. Timbre techniques with different amounts of air sounds using different shaped note heads. Percussive sounds, so key clicks and tongue stops. And also different pitch techniques, so actually turning the flute inwards and outwards to really change the pitch. And the first page of that score looks like this, and it really probably looks like another language. And I have done this for you so you can see exactly what I mean with some of the different sounds you've heard, and I'm just going to play this page for you. So that gives you a little bit of an idea of how they look. I am going to take you on a slightly 180 turn now and introduce you to several of the Māori flutes and some of the main elements of traditional Māori music. But do keep in mind all of those sounds just in the back of your mind, because we will be coming back to them in part 3. So it's understood that Polynesians began to arrive in New Zealand around 800 years ago. They brought with them their own traditions of Pacific Island music making, but also would have been met with a lot of new materials native to the country. So this included native trees. They were able to use the wood from those, different plants, native birds, and they did use the bones from those to make some of their instruments as well. Taongoporo is the umbrella term for Māori instruments, and it translates as singing treasures, which I really like. These treasures really have to be understood in tandem with Māori mythology, as it's very much interlinked with music. In the culture, the gods they control the different natural realms. Ranganui is the Sky Father, and it's said that melodies of melodic instruments drift up to the Sky Father. Papatuanuku is the Earth Mother, and the heartbeat, her heartbeat is associated with musical rhythm. Tangaroa was the god of the sea, and it was also said that that rhythmic wave motion was also associated with music. And Tawhirimatea was the god of the winds, which is an obvious one. So Māori music was traditionally used as a really strong connection between the physical and the spiritual world. Traditional music is often based on myths, stories, and emotions that are displayed by gods in mythology. And songs could be sorrowful, angry, they could be a lament, or a love song, or something more to do with peace and love. So very much the music was a part of daily life. The instruments were used to herald the arrival of people. They were also used to attract birds, to accompany chants and singing, to herald the arrival of a new baby, also at funerals, for healing rituals, and really used as this spiritual connection and a connection to well-being. The flutes in particular were used to complement words, and these could be spoken or sung. And it's important to remember that music to the Māori was not just about sounds, it was really about the meaning and the words that accompanied them. So I'm going to introduce you to two of the flutes today. The first is the kuowo, and this was very small, around 12 to 15 centimeters long. It had 3 finger holes and often a 4th hole at the bottom that was used for wrapping a cord around so you could carry it around with you. The kuowo is known to interact with native birds, even in recent years, and it's very much linked to the god of the forest, who was Tanna. About a third of the instruments that are currently housed in museums were actually made from human bone, but it's a very safe place to travel now. Some of them were made from whale-tooth ivory, others of wood, and also of albatross bone. The playing method is very interesting. It's not horizontal or vertical, but it's more diagonal, and the lips are placed on this edge so that the direction of the air really creates this a presence of breath in the sound because of the way that it's angled into the instrument. It has a very small microtonal range, and it's very common to do pitch bending and sliding between the notes that you may have on your instrument, and falling off at the end of a phrase, mimicking the human voice, is very much a part of this flute. And it's very important with all of these instruments to keep in mind that instead of the very standardized idea behind these flutes, with the kuowo, it was expected that every instrument would be entirely unique. So depending on what you were making it out of, where you drilled the holes, who was making it, who was playing it, all of these things meant that each one was expected to be entirely different. So I'm going to play you a short example. I wish I had one here, but this is thanks to Steve Garden at Rattle Records, who has let me play this for you today. This features Māori singing as well as several different kuowo. One is very high-pitched and another is lower. One of them is made from a moa bone, which is a giant flightless bird that is now extinct but existed in New Zealand at the time that these instruments were created. And one is made from human bone. And this particular song is to do with a funeral song and mourning.
Koira waru Tēnei He au nei Kai hawe Te reo Te mo
The second flute today is the puturino, which is very highly esteemed in Māori history due to its very strong links with mythology. Rokatauri was the goddess of flute music, and she was thought to live inside this cocoon, this case moth shape. It was said that she loved her flute so much that she chose to live inside it. It's been called a bugle flute due to the different playing techniques it has. It can actually be played using a trumpet embouchure at the top, and it can also be blown across that one hole in the middle like a flute. And this creates, due to the lack of finger holes, a very small range of notes, but a very wide range of timbral possibilities. It also has this third voice, often thought of as the spirit voice that emerges on particular puturino, and this was thought to be Weke, who was the daughter of Rokatauri, and she is sometimes heard but never seen. And it really links into that idea that all of the flutes are different, and some of them may have surprising notes, sometimes that are unexpected. These are much longer. They can vary anywhere between about 25 and 65 centimeters long, and they were made by traditionally splitting a length of wood in half and shaping the inside and binding the halves back together with often sap from native New Zealand plants. And like the kawawo, it's expected that the variation between them will be quite wide based on what they're made from. I am going to play you a short video of puturino player Rob Thorne from New Zealand. He is going to really show you some of the different playing techniques, the trumpet flute, the trumpet voice, the flute voice, the use of the different blowing ends. You'll see him using his hand to create some changes to the pitch, and the use of vibrato is also really interesting in this. So this is a video from 2018 in a live concert in New Zealand, and here we go. And thank you to Rob and to Sounds, the Centre for New Zealand Music, for the use of that video today. So just to recap over these two flutes, general features between them include this very small microtonal scale, pitch bending and sliding, the capability of having this very breathy timbre due both to the way that it's played and also to what they're made out of, and the fact that each instrument is entirely unique in its construction. So these flutes were very much part of daily life in pre-colonised New Zealand. I don't really have time to go into all of the detail about many European sailors and navigators who came across New Zealand and commented widely on the music that they came across. But I did choose one to share with you that I think will clearly illustrate a very Eurocentric view to this music that did lead to the demise of these instruments post-colonisation. So European discovery of New Zealand was actually in 1642 by the Dutch navigator Abel Tasman. And there's a story about how their ship was met by the putatara, which is a Māori trumpet, and then they responded with European Baroque trumpets. And then another 100 years went by with nothing in particular to report until 1769, well, I'm sure they were playing a lot of flute music. 1769, the British navigator James Cook landed in New Zealand, and this is one of his very telling accounts of what he heard. They have sonorous instruments, but they can scarcely be called instruments of music. One is a shell, the other is a small wooden pipe resembling a child's ninepin, only much smaller. And in this there is no more music than in a pea whistle. We never heard any attempt to sing to them or to produce with them any measured tones that bore the least resemblance to a tune. So you can see where this is going. With the arrival of British colonists came their instruments and their culture, which very quickly reigned supreme. And instead, the classic case of instead of really developing an appreciation for the very delicate nuances of these instruments, the strong spiritual links, these were the very things that missionaries were concerned by. And the instruments quickly faded from existence. Large-scale colonization in New Zealand was from 1840 onwards. The Treaty of Waitangi was signed in 1840 as an agreement between representatives of the British Crown and of the New Zealand Māori chiefs. But sadly, within just 50 years of that treaty, there is this quote, which I think is very telling. The instruments had become silent artifacts of a dying race, curiosities to be viewed through the Western lens of the museum. And there were other societal factors that led to the decline of the instruments. After the two world wars, Māori populations underwent rapid urbanization due to many things, including employment. And this also caused a drastic shift in the way that the society was structured, and they were very much disconnected from their culture and from their language. And Richard Nuns, in his book Te Auraporo, says that this was a decline and demise in the face of a dominant Western musical tradition and the decay of rich traditional life connections. Now, this post-World War time is a good time to check in with what was happening in terms of classical music and the arts in New Zealand. Around this time, New Zealand artists were really beginning to challenge the ties that they had to Britain, and were increasingly interested in what it was that would make their art or their music have some sort of unique New Zealand identity. The composer Douglas Lilburn, who's considered sort of the grandfather of New Zealand composition, pictured here in 1940, he gave a very famous speech in 1946, where he really said that the identity of New Zealand composition is only in the process of becoming. The necessity of having a music of our own, a living tradition of music created in this country, a music that will satisfy those parts of our being that cannot be satisfied by the music of other nations. And this is a talk that has been published and also much written about since then. There were other statements in visual arts and in literature as well that really, there are even quotes that said, there was a straining desire to cut free from the maternal England. So it's also interesting, given that this is sort of a largely North American audience, to consider the things that developed in the second half of the 20th century that led to the gradual re-emergence of these Māori flutes. So I wanted to quickly run through several milestones that I think are important just to know about. The first of which happened in 1975. The treaty that I had mentioned, that had been signed years earlier, was finally officially put into part of law in New Zealand, and there was a tribunal put together to really investigate historic breaches of that treaty. 1987, which is very recently, Māori language was officially made an official language of the country that I think, can better reflect the bicultural context. In 92, the National Museum was opened, and this museum had a real interest in acknowledging Māori culture and also protocol in the way that they dealt with artifacts in the museum. And their act says that there's a recognition of the power of taonga, which are cultural treasures, including the instruments, to communicate deep truths about our people. And so there is this notable shift by the 90s of a real desire to reconnect with Māori knowledge, language, and customs. In 1994, Creative New Zealand was established, and one of their guiding principles was also to really acknowledge cultural diversity and support specifically Māori culture. And in 1995, the Radio New Zealand Act was made official, and this included a commitment to services that stimulate, support, and reflect a wide range of music, including New Zealand composition and performance, that reflect New Zealand's cultural identity, including Māori language and culture. So I think this very, skimmed over list, I'm not saying that any of these structures are perfect, but it is important in this context to understand the pretext to the revival of these instruments. So at the same time as this sort of repositioning, I suppose, of Māori culture in terms of government and policy, these three men happened to meet. Hirini Melbourne, on the left, was from the Ngaituhoi tribe. Māori was his first language. He was a composer, musician, and author. He taught at the Māori Studies program at Waikato University. He would have turned 70 this year if he was still alive. He sadly passed away in 2003. Brian Flintoff in the middle, he grew up in a very remote area of the South Island. He trained as a school teacher, and in his spare time, he honed skills as a bone carver. Many of his students in his community were Māori, and he became really fascinated with Māori bone carving in particular. And this was really where his interest in the making of taongaporo came from. And Richard Nuns on the right, he actually had his musical background was really in brass bands and in jazz. But while he was doing his teacher training, he assisted with building a marae, which is a meeting house in the Waikato region, the same place that Hirini is from. And this was the beginning of his lifelong sort of communication with Māori and his dedication to learning how to play these incredible flutes. So these three men met at a Māori artist and writers meeting in 1985, and this was the beginning of their move to really revive these instruments. They began holding meetings on marae around the country, and this was really to learn from people, to share knowledge, and essentially reconstruct the musical history based on people's memories. They also began making new instruments based on what they found, and they took these instruments to be played within the communities to find out more about the sounds that they were hearing. And Richard Nuns speaks of this really unique method by saying, the music survived in the memories of the elders and the people, in some of the ancient instruments themselves, and in traditional songs, proverbs, and carvings, and some was also recorded by the observations of ethnographers. And this commitment to really including the Māori community in an ongoing dialogue that has really now been for more than 40 years has really allowed this process to be so successful, even when the process has involved non-Māori. And they happened to have these complementary skills, so a knowledge of the Māori culture, the musicianship, and the carving ability. So all of these things really came together to empower these instruments to come back again. There have been a lot of writings in recent years about this revival, and I've chosen several to share with you that I think just illustrate very clearly what this has meant in New Zealand. The first one is from the late ethnomusicologist Alan Thomas, who talks about the methods of this group. It was a new kind of research that placed the instruments and the community at the centre of the investigation, respecting the musicality and memories of the elders. There was no preaching from old ethnographic studies, no assertion that it had to be this way or that, just a readiness to work with the people and the sounds. This was one of the most profound decolonizations of ethnomusicology which has occurred. And a second very similar quote from Ariana Tiko, who is a performer of Māori instruments, and she worked in the 90s with rehousing some tanguporo collections in a museum in New Zealand. And she says that the revival of the Māori instruments was part of a wider movement of decolonization in New Zealand. And the last one here from Awhina Tamarapa, she says, in today's world, tanguporo not only have the ability to heal people through their sounds and music, but can also heal on another level through restoring cultural pride, knowledge, and identity, reclaiming traditions as a healing process and reclaiming identity. So I think these commentaries give you just a quick insight into what the instrument revival has meant, and it's really also become amazingly integrated within the musical culture and classical music in particular. So tanguporo have recently been commissioned by orchestras. There's a Puterino concerto being performed very soon. It's also been used in chamber music where small ensembles have combined flutes and Māori flutes, or stringed instruments and Māori instruments. You can hear these sounds they're very prevalent in documentaries, in television and film. You may have seen the film Whale Rider that included performances by Richard Nuns and Hirini Melbourne. Also, the film Once Were Warriors, or Taika Waititi's film Boy, which is a little more recent, which actually mixes Māori action song and pop songs. Commercial recordings have also included Māori instruments, or the emulation of the Māori instruments, even saxophones playing using the same kind of wailing techniques as we hear on the flutes. Very interestingly, in a few months, the International Society for Contemporary Music are holding their World Music Days in New Zealand, and their categories for composers included, orchestra, string quartet, piano trio, and tanguporo, which I think is a reflection of just how standard it is as an art form in the 21st century. There have also been competitions and awards set up to cater for these instruments. And interestingly, also during only the last 10 years, there have been visits back to the British Museum, where a number of the tanguporo that were taken over 150 years ago have been played again by practitioners of the instrument. So essentially giving these museum artifacts a voice again. So let's go back to some music now. And this flute I've been holding this whole time. Part 3 looks at the convergence of these techniques that I showed you in part 1 and some of the sounds that you heard in those Māori flutes. You'll remember this table. So keep those sounds in mind as I play you some examples. The first composition is by Helen Fisher. She is in her 70s now. At the very beginning of the tanguporo revival, she had a residency as a composer in schools. She also initiated the very first New Zealand Composing Women's Festival in 1993. This work, Te Tangi a Te Mātui, was her first major composition, the first of many that reflected a very bicultural musical journey. She's collaborated very extensively with Māori performing artists, in some very large-scale musical dramas and works that involve dance and vocal music. She says about this work, it's based on a Māori karakia, which is an incantation or a prayer, where the flutist first sings and then blends the sound of the singing with her instrument. The ornate flute style, including the use of microtones, is inspired by that of the kuwawo. And this particular song was given to Helen in 1986 by her Māori language teacher, Te Ariki May. The first page of the work is actually entirely singing. It's a sort of a loose transcription of the song that she has written out, but also says that it can be very rubato in the way that it's played. And the second section of the work includes some really interesting points where the flute and the voice are played next to each other and also simultaneously. So I'll play this example for you. Kia whakarongo Keep te tangi a te manu nei. Don't know if anyone knew I was going to be singing today. The second example is a really good example of the way that extended techniques can allow just a single note on the flute to sound very different over just the course of this particular line. And the last example on this page is the end of the piece, and it includes the squiggly line at the end as an indication to slow down the speed of the vibrato, and it ends on this very soft whistling sound similar to the kuwawo. And the second work that I will talk about today is by Dame Gillian Whitehead. It was commissioned by the New Zealand International Arts Festival in the year 2000. It was premiered at that festival actually by a former teacher of mine, Bridget Douglas, and pianist Rachel Thompson. While I keep talking, I'll invite pianist Seren Barry, who just became an uncle today, to come to the stage. Gillian Whitehead uses her Māori ancestry combined with her own musical training in New Zealand and in Europe in a really interesting way in all of her music and in this piece. Her very long career has included a number of residencies with New Zealand ensembles, commissions by festivals and ensembles. She's been very active within the compositional scene. She was recently awarded an Arts Icon Award for her contribution to the musical landscape of New Zealand. The name taurangi has a number of different meanings in Māori language that really are useful to know before you hear the piece. It can mean unsettled, changeable or changing, incomplete, unsatisfied, to grieve for, or wanderer. So many things there. And Gillian has outlined in the score the context of the piece from her perspective. She says, "I began writing this piece in the shadow of both the East Timor crisis and the death of my good friend and sometimes mentor of many years, the musicologist and historian John Mansfield Thompson." And he wrote the Oxford History of New Zealand Music. These events modified both the original formal ideas and the detail of the piece. And in this work, she uses the Western concert flute both in very traditional ways and the piano also in very traditional ways, and also uses a number of extended techniques to also emulate these sounds of Māori flutes. She uses some interesting playing inside the piano, including glissandos and the use of a ping pong ball on some of the lower strings that you'll hear later. The first example that we'll play you has a very overt instruction for a breathy sound. There's also a timbral trill that you can really hear these kind of microtonal sounds that you've heard earlier today. The next example uses a series of soft ascending notes that merge into multiphonics. And Gillian says about this section, I was looking for something that gave me a series of Gs or something around that pitch. So I think this can link to the idea that maybe the exact pitches are not necessarily as important as the gesture and the timbral quality of whatever sound comes out. And also that, to me, the idea of that spirit voice or the extra voice on the puterino is very apparent here. Very strange standing on this side of Seren. The third example includes another whistle tone and also some pitch bends that also don't really specify where they need to end up, just the direction of the gesture. And the final example here is perhaps the most overt use of something directly from traditional Māori music, and that's this instruction of falling off of breath, which is similar to what you heard on that audio recording of the kuowo. And you'll also hear a timbral trill and then another trill that uses some alternative fingerings, as well as a ping pong ball. So we will play that entire work at the very end of the presentation, but first of all, I will talk about the commission of the new work so that you can walk out to music rather than talking. This new piece is written by New Zealand composer Chris Gendel. There are a number of reasons that I was really interested in asking him to write this work. He had written for solo flute before, so was very well versed in extended techniques, and so for me it was a nice element that we would actually be starting from a similar starting point in terms of having the sounds and the capabilities in our head, and then from there we were able to explore. Like me, he's also, he grew up in New Zealand but did musical training overseas, as many New Zealand musicians do. He has a PhD from Cornell, where he studied with Stephen Stuckey. And as a side note, 2 years ago, he actually spent a summer on an artistic residency in Italy with Professor Chris Paul Harmon from here. Chris Gendel and I also worked together at Radio New Zealand Concert, which was that public broadcaster that was very focused on the broadcasting of New Zealand content and of Māori music as well. At the moment, Chris is also the president of the Composers Association of New Zealand, which is hosting that International Society for Contemporary Music World Music Days with that Taongaporo category. So many connections. He's also a friend of mine, and I really like his music. We started with many discussions about what the piece might involve, how the research might inform the composition. First, Chris, who's currently based in New Zealand, he actually went to Te Papa, the National Museum of New Zealand. He found some recordings of Putarino, he transcribed them, he did a spectral analysis. This is very much a Chris approach. And in the meantime, as I did more and more reading about the revival of the flutes in particular, I came across I made my own list of some elements that I thought might be interesting to include. And not all of these made the cut, but it's interesting to talk about the process. So I was very interested in using some of the playing techniques of the Māori flutes. So potentially the trumpet embouchure of the Putarino could be an interesting colour. The different embouchure blowing angles, these things to create more air in the sound. Also pitch bending, so the rolling of fingers off the holes to create the same microtonal shifts as the wooden flutes. And vibrato shifts, so using vibrato as a technique to change pitch and timbre. And the second thing I was interested in was some of the discovery methods that were used by Hirani Melbourne, Richard Nuns, and Brian Flintoff. So as I researched more, it became apparent that on their travels around New Zealand, they had actually taken in flutes and had elders sing traditional waiata into the flutes. And so to me, that was immediately a link between singing and playing as an extended technique and the discovery technique that they'd used. And also note bending. In their own methods, they would have workshops on making these instruments. And they actually had a process of learning how to do microtonal pitch bends to imitate the human voice before they actually drilled the tone holes into the flute. So there were many things I thought could have been included, but it's a 5-minute work. So we then began this process of back and forth on FaceTime and on Skype about some of the extended techniques. So Chris would send me screenshots from, the one on the right is from Robert Dick's treatise, The Other Flute, and he would say, how does this sound? Does it, is it ergonomic? And that one actually sounds like this. So you can immediately hear that sort of the microtonal shifting in a downward direction. And he would send me things, does this trumpet embouchure work when you play it straight before a tongue ram, and these sorts of things. So really a really nice dialogue that is such a treat when you have the opportunity to work with a composer in that way. And these tiny fragments turned into the beginnings of the draft of the work, and he's one of the clearest people I've seen on providing fingering charts that are really easy to understand for any composers who are watching this. Flutists like that a lot. And I'm going to just play you this first part so you can get a sense of these sounds. And I will just read out a quick statement that Chris sent that will form the program note for this piece. He said, "During initial discussions with Hannah on this work and its particular focus, I immediately thought of the Putarino, the flute that sings with many voices. I designed the work to exploit the changes in colour and articulation available to the flute using material derived from melodic transcriptions and spectral analyses of Putarino recordings. The synthesis of inspiration and musical material unfolds in a way that will make the flute sing with a multitude of voices similar to that of the source." And so here is that introduction. And there is now a draft of the work. I am not premiering it today. It will be happening in this hall, actually, on April 17th at 3 o'clock. If anyone is interested in attending, you're more than welcome. So that brings me to the end of the presentation. I hope that everyone has taken something new away, whether that be about extended techniques, Māori music, New Zealand history, something about some composers you may never have heard of, and just some insight into the process of commissioning a new piece with a composer. And to finish, Seren and I will now perform Gillian Whitehead's Taurangi. Thank you so much for coming. I think there is a Q&A. I know some people have to run away, but if you do have questions, feel free to ask them now. I think there is a yeah.
Thank you for the concert. Do children learn to play the flutes in New Zealand, or do people have them in their homes, like their families have these traditional ancient flutes?
Yeah, I mean, I think they're becoming more and more used. The music is also gradually becoming more a part of what happens in schools as well. I know it was the early 90s, but I was in a kapahaka group at school where we did action songs and made some of the instruments. Often it's the more straightforward, not necessarily the flutes, but there are percussive instruments and things that you use in the air that create wind sound. And those are, I think, probably more used as kind of a fun instrument for children. But yeah, I'm not entirely sure in terms of whether children would be learning them in their homes necessarily, but I'd like to think so. Yeah, but some of the flute techniques are just probably a little more complicated to learn. Yeah. Yeah. Was there anybody else? Oh no. I should have seen this coming.
I'm really fascinated by the convergences that you're talking about. I think it's really striking the sort of the osmosis between cultures that's going on there.
Yeah.
And there seems to be, at least from what you've presented here, a little bit less of this notion of don't touch our instruments and our culture because they're sacred, and if white people do it, then it's somehow ruins it. What we deal with here in North America is called cultural appropriation.
Yeah, it's a hot topic in musicology at the moment, for sure.
So I was wondering if you could tell us a little about the attitude towards that, and where there seems to be a bit more of the back and forth and sharing and interpenetration of the cultures.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was really set off on the right foot in terms of the way that the revival occurred. So it was always this idea of it was a two-way dialogue. It was never, these are ours, we would like to be involved. But yeah, I think for me, there's certainly been you do wonder what the reaction will be when you put these sounds that are so convergent into Western classical music and into the notation, which is not obviously something that would have occurred before. But I think the context, once you're aware of the context, it's much easier to see how it's not such a sensitive topic. I think certainly unless you have a real understanding of the history and the meaning behind the instruments, for me the really important part is what the sounds mean and what they relate to. And then I think there's been a real openness to them being included in classical music and in jazz and in many other things. I think one of the most common places that these instruments are seen also are any sort of state occasion, dignitaries visiting. Māori music is always featured, or if groups are going overseas. Even early 2000s, I was in the New Zealand Secondary Students Choir, and we traveled Canada, the States, China, Hong Kong, and all of those concerts we gave all included music of actually Pacific Islands and of Māori culture. So I think there's a real pride as well in showing the music that is part of the country, whether or not you may be directly, ancestrally linked to the culture. Yeah. It's a roundabout way of answering that question. All right, well, thank you everyone again for being here. I know there are many people here that are friends, colleagues, staff, faculty. I think my boss is here as well, and I really do appreciate the support. It means a lot. So thanks again.